I'm Kyla and welcome back to the Infinite Library. And today this is going to be a video doing one of my kind of most exciting things that I've been looking forward to all year, and that is my end of year stats video. I'm someone that loves lists. I love seeing stats and stuff, and obviously I've been reading a lot this year. I've been reviewing a lot more this year, and I've been reading a lot of things that I never would have thought I would have read this year. So I'm really excited to see how this kind of looks in terms of my stats, especially compared to how it was last year when I didn't read as much. So without further ado, let's get into the numbers. Right, so glasses on for this one because I'm going to be looking at my computer screen, which you can't see, but it's just down here. And I'm going to need a good cup of tea to get me through this because there's a lot of stats. Some of these are stats that I've just compiled myself. Some of them are stats that have been very handily generated by my Storygraph. So yeah, let's go through them. So the first stat to kind of go over is the number of books that I read in 2023. And I'm really happy with what I read, honestly. Like, my goal was 100 books going into this year, and I actually managed to read 130 books. So I smashed it, I surpassed it. Really happy with that. I'm not gonna try and set a larger goal really for the coming year because I feel like 100 books is just a nice little baseline for me to go on. If I read more, awesome. If not, I'm happy with 100 books. So last year I actually read 72 books. So I managed to read a whole 58 books more than I read last year. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm actually going to be doing a little video later on in the month where I'm sort of looking at some of my books that were my worst and my best books over the last 10 years. So you'll kind of see then how my reading has kind of gone up and down, I suppose, and how much I've been able to read, and how this year, 2023, has definitely been my best reading year in a long time. And it just feels so good to be reading again. It feels just so good to be enjoying reading again. So yeah, really happy with that. So 130 books for 2023. I DNF'd 5 books. So not the worst. I know that some people are very they're big DNFers. I'm not. I'm very much more of I will struggle through a book, but I've actually tried to realize more this year when I'm not going to enjoy a book and when it's best just to leave it, especially when there's other books I just want to read more. So yeah, I only DNF 5, but usually I would never DNF, so that's kind of a big number for me anyway. So in total, the number of pages I read in 2023 is 37,816 pages. And I had an average book length of around 300 pages. That seems to be my kind of average, my sweet spot for reading books. I definitely read shorter books, I definitely read longer books, but according to my Storygraph little stats, which I was showing here, a nice little pie chart they've generated, it looks like around the 300 page mark is kind of my ideal book size. And I'd honestly agree with that. Short books I find just don't go into enough detail for me. I do enjoy longer books, but also I am very much someone who will see a big chunky read and I think it will make me slow down a little bit sometimes, unless I'm already super invested. For example, when I read Swordcatcher, granted, Swordcatcher was not a book I was hugely enjoying, but I was just kind of intimidated how big it was. Yeah, having that 300 page mark, that is a book that I can really get into, and it's usually a book that I can read in a couple of days a lot of the time, which is the perfect time for me to spend with a book. So carrying on with Storygraph, they also do a little thing that's kind of your top genres read, and according to Storygraph, I don't know if I fully believe this because I find there's a lot of crossover between genres and stuff. So some will be multiple genres, some are genres that I don't necessarily count as genres. So according to Storygraph anyway, my top 5 genres I read this year were fantasy at the top, surprising nobody, LGBTQ+, horror, young adult, and manga. So I generally don't count young adult as being like a genre, to be honest. It's just more of an age range, so I wouldn't have picked that as a genre, but it is interesting to see that those are kind of my top five. I'm glad that manga and horror are up there. LGBTQ plus is no surprise. Like I feel like quite a lot of the books I do read are LGBTQ plus, and I'm always trying to read diversely, which I'll continue doing. So I did my own little breakdown essentially of what all the books that I've read throughout the year, like what kind of genres I would put them into, just so I can see for myself what genres I'm reading more than others. And then in the coming year, if there's genres that I feel like maybe I'm not reading very much, then that is something that I'll just kind of focus on. And it's just nice to kind of see what genres like I've leaned towards the most. I basically have been tracking my reading just over the last couple of months. I started doing this because I found it a lot easier for doing things like my wrap-ups, doing this end of year stats video. I have been like tracking them, and I put my own genre of what I feel is kind of like the predominant genre of them. So I don't actually have LGBTQ listed as a genre, otherwise I feel like it would be in so many of my books. But I did go through and I checked out all the books, and I worked out that of the 130 books I read, 62 of them did fall into the LGBTQ kind of area, so decent. So going into the actual genres, seeing how much I read of each one, I read 51 fantasy, surprising no one. That's like, it's not half of my books, but it's definitely a lot of my books. I read 25 manga or manhwa. Manhwa is kind of like the Chinese variant of manga. Again, not much of a surprise. I love manga. It's honestly a number I kind of want to increase in the coming year because I don't feel like I've been reading as much manga as I used to. But 25, even so. I read 15 graphic novels throughout the year. I read 12 contemporary books, which is honestly a surprising figure for me because I used to rarely ever read contemporary books, and it's something I've started to read a little bit more as I've heard more about different books that actually interest me. Like, I am predominantly a fantasy, horror, manga kind of person, and I tended to not usually be that keen on contemporary stuff, particularly because I was under this like wrong assumption that so much of the contemporary books are romance, and I think it's just what I was seeing was mostly romance. So I mean, some of these are definitely romance that I read this year, but I've definitely been learning about what contemporary as a genre means and how wide a genre it is, so I definitely want to be trying more contemporary in the future. I read 11 horror books, which is not as much as I wanted to, so I definitely want to read more of that next year. I read 7 thriller/mystery books, which is a new figure for me because it's only really this year that I have started to read thriller mystery, and I'm still kind of finding my feet with it. Like, I found a lot of them I haven't gelled with. Like, I think a lot of like the big thrillers that are really popular are just not my kind of thing. I think I've enjoyed mystery more than I have thriller, but I kind of want to keep trying it and seeing what sort of things work for me, because when they work, they really work, and otherwise they're just kind of forgettable for me, I suppose. But yeah, I managed 7, so I'm happy with that. I read 5 sci-fi, a figure I definitely want to improve upon because I just feel like there's so much good sci-fi out there and I'm missing out by not reading it. I read 4 non-fiction books. Not surprising, I don't read non-fiction too often, to be honest. It's just not really my thing. Read 3 historical books, 2 biographies. I do quite like a biography, so there's more of those I would like to read in the coming year. And finally, I read 1 poetry book, which if you've seen my wrap-up for December, you'll know what that is. I'm not a poetry person, but I found one that I read and I liked it. So yeah, that is the breakdown of the genres. Fairly diverse, but I still read a lot of fantasy. It's kind of my main thing, and I don't think that's ever going to change, really. I think it's always going to be my favorite go-to genre, but I'm glad I'm starting to read more diversely, and I want to continue doing that going forward. Okay, so breaking this down into the ratings. So I have a little graphic from Storygraph which kind of shows all of this, which I'll put up. I've also wanted to put this in like star ratings of the kind of like what I rated throughout the year. I'm also going to be doing a tier ranking as another video at some point this month, because there's a lot of books that I read prior to me starting BookTube, and I just thought it would be a really fun way to sort of see my book journey throughout the years. So, and you know, who doesn't love a good tier ranker? So I'm going to be doing one of those, and that will be where you'll see me going over, briefly, but going over every single book that I've read throughout this year. I'm not going to do that in this because it would be way too much for me to go through every single book. But if you're interested in what I've read throughout this whole year, watch out for that tier ranker video that will be coming very soon. So in terms of the star ratings, I very happily had no 1-star books during this year. I think if I'd carried on reading the few books that I DNF'd, they may have been a 1-star, but I dodged that bullet and I've had no 1-stars to report. I had 13 2-stars. I had 58 3-star reads, I had 49 4-star reads, and 11 5-stars, which I'm very happy about. Nice to actually get some 5-stars. When I was doing my video where I was looking back at what I read over the last 10 years, and there was a year when I had no 5-stars, so a year where I at least get 1 5-star is a good year for me. So looking at that, 3 and 4-star is kind of my average, and 3-star is the highest amount, which is a shame. I would have liked that to at least have been in the 4-star, but they're very similar numbers. So yeah, 3-star has been my kind of average rating for the year, and it makes sense because I've been reading a lot of stuff that is me trying out new things rather than me reading things that like I know I'm probably gonna love. So having 3-star as my highest makes sense, honestly. And I still had a lot of 4-stars, I had some 5-stars, so it's not the worst in terms of rating. So in terms of the format of my books, I've done a little pie chart to show how I've been reading my books. As expected, I've mostly been reading them in print format, in physical format. I'll always prefer physical format, to be honest, but there are a few books that I read throughout the year that I read on my e-reader, mostly because I was traveling or because I just didn't have a physical copy of them. So I had some digital, and I did try, I think, like one book, a short story by audio, and that's something I want to try out a little bit more going into 2024. I'm already trying it, actually, because I have been reading The Priory of the Orange Tree via audiobook, because I feel like with it being such a long book, a book with a lot of different characters, a lot of names, I felt like it would lend itself well to audio, and yeah, it's been interesting so far kind of doing it. So I want to try more audio, but I think I'm probably always going to be more of a physical reader than anything else. So in terms of the source of my books, where I got them from, I do have a little pie chart again to show for this, but the breakdown is that 55 of the 130 books I read were from my TBR. So that is something that I want to have as a higher number in 2024. And the reason for why it was only 55 from my TBR is because my library books account for 44 of my books. So I got a lot of books out from the library. Don't regret that. I always love going to the library, finding things that maybe I wouldn't have found, that you're maybe not sure you're going to like. So I do that a lot for books where I'm not entirely sure and I'm hoping I'll like it, but I don't want to risk spending money on something that I'll kind of regret. So I'll often trial books through the library first, and I'll definitely still always be continuing to do that. But my physical TBR is big, and I want to focus on getting through that a little bit more. So of the rest of how I source my books, 24 of the books that I read were ones I'd bought specifically to read, like for that specific time. I borrowed 7 books, whether that was from friends, whether that was from, I think I stayed in an Airbnb for a little while and I borrowed some books from there. I reread 7 books, and I read 3 books online. And then finally, the last stat is that I had 1 book sent to me, which was an ARC. So that was where my books came from during this year. So, whilst I was looking through all the stats that Storygraph made me, there was an interesting one that I kind of want to look at because it's not one I really thought about, but it's mood. So it's basically like the kind of mood and emotions that you get from reading books and which ones I'm more drawn to. So I have a pie chart and it looks like I have 4 like really big kind of like these are the ones I go for. And that is adventurous, mysterious, dark, and emotional. So yeah, kind of heavy, I suppose. My other ones, which were lesser, but apparently I also veered more towards books that were light-hearted, reflective, tense, funny, hopeful, challenging, sad, inspiring, and informative. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me overly. Like adventurous, I obviously have been reading a lot of fantasy, mystery, dark, I read a lot of horror, emotional, I just like emotional books, I guess. So yeah, I thought that was just interesting to see because it's not really something I think about in terms of how I read is like what kind of theme I go for in terms of how I'm feeling. Like I wouldn't call myself a mood reader, to be honest. I am sometimes in the mood for like a horror or a fantasy, but I don't read by my mood a lot of the time. I'm usually kind of like just excited to read all the things. So it's rare for me to read by mood. So it's interesting to see kind of where my books kind of fit in terms of that and see, I guess, what I would read if I was a mood reader, I suppose. So something else that Storygraph handily told for me was the shortest book I read and the longest book I read throughout the year. So the shortest book I read was actually one that was published on Tor.com. It was just like a short story called The 3 O'Clock Dragon by John Wiswell, and it was 18 pages, which I didn't realise because I read it online on their website. But yeah, apparently it was 18 pages. And the longest book of the year, I actually have it, so let me get it. Yeah, surprising no one, this is the longest book I read in 2023. It is massive. I'm already reading books longer in January, so that figure is definitely going to change. But yeah, this edition at least is 617 pages. So pretty chunky. I still think it's I love these edges, they're so gorgeous, but you'll hear me talking more about this book shortly because it's going to be in some of my other stats. So next, another thing that was on my Storygraph, graphic again for it here, was my most read authors of the year. And this was something I never even really think about, honestly. Like, I think I read... I am someone that if I like a book by an author, I will tend to check out their backlog, their backlist of books, and read more. But I don't really think about what authors I've read the most during a year. So, of those most read authors, I'm only going to go over the top 3 here, I think, because looking at some of these other, like, most read authors, they're just stuff that I've read 1 or 2 books, so I don't necessarily say I would count them as, like, I've read them the most. But these are the ones that I definitely have read, like, a decent amount from. So I don't have any of them physically, funnily enough, but the most read author I've read in 2023 is Rikishi 7, who, if you've not heard of him, he is a Japanese creator who wrote the original Higurashi series. He also wrote the Umineko series, and there's a couple of other series that he writes. They are basically horror, mystery, psychological kind of series. Originally they were all visual novels, and they've since been adapted into animes, and they've got manga versions as well. So often the artwork in the manga is done by various different artists, and there's often sometimes there's also like a sub-writer who will write like the actual kind of dialogue within the manga, but the main story that has like come from it is by Rikishi 7. The characters, the storyline, the plot, that kind of thing is all him. So I read 10 books by him in the Higurashi series, which makes sense because I've been trying to get through that series. That was kind of one of my things I was doing this year. I still haven't finished the Higurashi series because there are a lot of books in that series. There's like over 20 or something, probably over 30 at this point. Plus I want to also read the Umineko series, which is like a side kind of spin-off kind of thing set in like, it's either the same universe or a different universe, but there are crossovers basically. So yeah, I read 10 of his books for the Higurashi series, and I'll definitely be continuing that going forward. Next, not surprising really because I did a whole vlog on it, Jill Murphy is my next most read author with 8 books, and it is all 8 books in the Worst Witch series. And then finally, I've only got 2 books to hand because the other 2 are borrowed, but Alice Oseman is my 3rd most read author. So the only ones I've actually had physically that I read this year was Nick and Charlie and Heartstopper Volume 5. And I also read 2 books which you'll see in my December wrap-up video in This Winter and I Was Born for This. So yeah, I'm enjoying reading her stuff. I've obviously already read all the Heartstopper books, but I have the rest of her novels on my shelves that I'm hoping to get to at some point. So I wouldn't say she's a favourite author, but I find her a very easy to read author. So I think that checks out that she is one of my most read authors in 2023. Also, when I was looking at the stats, just because I thought it was interesting, I actually read from 87 authors for the very first time ever. So that's quite a lot of like new authors I've tried really, so I just thought that was fun to find out. So still on author stats, I wanted to go over what are my top 5 favourite new authors I found in 2023. So I had actually read one of this person's books before, but it was like a non-fiction book and I liked it, but it didn't stick with me. But this was the year that I discovered how good of an author Juno Dawson is. Primarily with the series, I want to read more books by her because I know she has some others. She has another book which is coming out in 2024, which is a prequel to this series, but I just really enjoyed Her Majesty's Royal Coven series. I thought it was just super solid, such a lot of fun, and definitely cemented Juno Dawson as like an auto-buy author for me going forward. Another author that I only read 1 book of, but it automatically has made her kind of like an auto-read author for me, and I don't have a physical copy at the moment, but it's Mona Awad. I read Bunny earlier in the year and I adored it. It was just so good. It was everything I wanted basically from that type of book. So I definitely want to read more Mona Awad in the coming year because I really enjoyed it. Another one that I discovered is Carmen Maria Machado, who I've only read her short fiction, which is kind of horror psychological based, Her Body and Other Parties, but I do have her autobiographical book In the Dream House somewhere around here to read at some point, and I just loved this. It was a 5-star anthology for me. I love her writing style, and yeah, just someone I really discovered this year and enjoyed so much. Another author I discovered this year, one I've been meaning to get to for a while, but is TJ Klune. So I've still only read, I think it's just 2 books of theirs I've read so far. I started with Under the Whispering Door, and then I read In the Liza Puppet, and this was like a 5-star for me. This was a 4-star, and I love them both. So I want to read more of their backlist. I know they've got like a Wolf series. Obviously I want to read the Cerulean Sea one. I've forgotten what it's called, but I'll put a graphic up here for it here. But yeah, really, really loving TJ Klune's books. Can't wait to read more of them. And the final author I'll say I've discovered this year is Rebecca Ross. Again, it's one that I've only read 1 book of so far in Divine Rivals. I have Ruthless Vows, the sequel, over there to read, like, ASAP, basically, but I want to read more from this author. I want to read their River Enchanted series. And yeah, I just really loved this. It made me feel so many things, and it just cemented them as, like, one of my favourite new authors. So that is all the new authors that I read. Looking now at more of, like, the book stats themselves, I guess. So I was kind of interested to have a look at, like, series I've been reading, and how many series I was actually reading, how many I was starting, and also how many standalone books I read. So I read a lot of series, but I also really love standalones. I love having a complete story all in one thing and not be like having to wait for the next book coming out. Obviously, you know, some books you love so much you just want all the sequels, but occasionally I just think it's nice to have these standalone books as well. So of my 130 books, I read 55 were standalones, so that means 75 of them, the majority, were actually sequels or books in a series. And then I was curious, I wanted to call myself out actually, about how many series I started this year. and how many I finished. Spoilers, not many. But I started, of the new series that I started throughout my whole of 2023, I started 40 series. And of those 40 series, there are 6 that I will not be carrying on. Those are The Magician's Guild, Lesser Known Monsters, My Secret Affection, Swordcatcher, the Night Watch series, that's a soft DNF, I might go back to that one at some point, and the X-Hex. So those were books that just didn't work for me. They're part of a series, but I'm not going to be carrying them on. But the other 34 series I will be carrying on. So the actual series I completed this year was 6. So honestly, that's not too bad to say like how long some series are. So I'm pretty happy I did at least finish some series, even if I started like 40 of them. So of the 6 series that I've completed, some of them I have physically, some I don't. I finished the Raven Boys cycle by Maggie Stiefvater. I don't own those anymore. I unhauled them once I'd finished them. I also have, these I do have all physically, and it's the Scholarmance series by Naomi Novik. I read Deadly Education last year, I think, really enjoyed it. And then there was also a Naomi Novik event that happened during this year, and also all my colleagues got into this at the same time. So we were all kind of reading it and it was really fun, so that really got me into finishing the series. But yeah, it's a 3-book series, and I have 4 because I managed to find the hardback version of The Golden Enclave, which I adore. I adore the hardbacks for this series, but they're so hard to find nowadays, so I just have the first 3 in paperback, but they are all signed because I went to that Naomi Novik event, and then I managed to find the 3rd one in physical. So yeah, that was a series I did finish. I'm hoping to start her Temeraire series next year as well, but I think that's a lot longer. So yeah, I finished that. I also finished off the Hannibal book series by Thomas Harris. I'd already read Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs previously, but I wanted to get to the last 2 books in the series, which is Hannibal and Hannibal Rising. Unfortunately, I preferred the first 2 books in this series a lot more than the last 2, so that was a bit of a shame, but I'm glad to have finally read it all. I think I'm probably at least going to be unhauling Hannibal Rising because I really didn't enjoy this one. Hannibal had moments I really liked, but then there was just a storyline twist that I wasn't keen on, but I think I will still keep hold of it. But this one I think is gonna go. And then the last 2 series I read, one was a manga series which I did complete, and that was Dick Fight Island. You saw me reviewing it, I really enjoyed it. It's only 2 books, although it may get more, I'm not entirely sure at the moment, but at current I don't believe it's got any more expected to come out, so I'm just gonna say this is a finished series for now. And then the final series I finished was just another duology, and that was the Malice series by, what's her name? Heather Walter. So it's 2 books. I don't have the sequel because I took it out from the library, so it's Malice and then the sequel is Misrule. And I enjoyed them a lot. I actually enjoyed the sequel more than I enjoyed the first one. And I probably will pick it up at some point just so I have the complete collection. But yeah, I actually read these with my book club. So we read Malice, and then people enjoyed it so much that they wanted to carry it on, so we ended up reading the sequel the next month. So that was kind of nice to actually read a whole series with my book club. Oh, sorry, I did forget one, even though it's one I've already shown you. I of course finished the Worst Witch series, which I'd never actually fully completed before. I'd read the first 5 before, and then the last 3 were totally new to me. So that was another series that I completed in 2023. Now I want to go over my whole year in reading, really, and look at what I read each month, kind of see how many I read throughout each month and what my average rating was. So I have, I've done some graphics here that's just going to show you like each of the books I read this month, because I'm not going to go into them individually because they're in my wrap-ups or they're going to be in the tier ranking video, so I'm just going to go over this quite briefly. In January I read 6 books, so that was actually my lowest reading month in the whole year with just the 6 books. I was just sort of getting back into reading at that point. And I had an average rating of 4.08, which is really good, but also I didn't read very much, so I'm gonna say it's kind of expected that I didn't read many books, but I read really good books. So 6 books in January. February I read 10 books with an average of 3.25. March I read 7 books with an average of 3.35. April I read 11 books, average of 3.68. May I read 10 books, average of 3.55. This is rating, by the way. Sorry, I didn't think I said that. But this is an average rating of whatever it is. June, I read 11 books with an average rating of 3.5. July, I also read 11 books with an average rating of 3.5 again. So weirdly the same stats between June and July, which I thought was quite interesting. August, which was Magical Readathon, Aurelium, so I read a bit more. And I read 12 books that month with an average of 3.6 as my rating. September, I read 9 books, so down a little bit, but it makes sense because I read a lot during August. And an average rating of 3.78. October, this was my best month of the whole year, and I blame that completely on Becca's Spookopoly-thon because it was just motivating me so much to read. So in October, I read 22 books. Average rating of 3.41, which is lower than a lot of the other averages, but I read so much, it makes sense. November, we went back to a more normal number for me, and that was 11 books, average of 3.95. And finally, in December, I was off for a lot of the month, so I had time to read a bit more, and so I managed to read 14 books with an average rating overall of 3.75. So looking at that, I can see that October clearly was my best reading month of the year with 22 books, and my worst reading month was January, where I only read 6 books. And I kind of worked out that I kind of have like a monthly average number really from this, in that 11 books seems to be kind of like something that I seem to be getting to as it went on. Like after that first low month, 11 books was kind of like my average, which is really interesting. I read about 2 books a week or something, and overall my yearly average rating is a 3.6. Would like that to be a bit higher, but it's honestly not the worst. There's another chart here from Storygraph which I thought was quite fun, and it's kind of showing the configuration of my books per month and my pages read per month. And you can see like I dipped down in March. Weirdly, I dipped down lower in March and February. I went up again in April, which checks out because it was Magical Readathon. Down again in May, up again in June, down in July, up in August, Magical Readathon again. September was down, and October just goes wee way up. And then it averages out again towards the end of the year. So that very much checks out. And just because I'm curious, I thought I would just kind of like look at each month, and I'll say, I'm not going to go over each book, but I will say which is my favourite book I read each month. So January, I would say my favourite book I read in January was The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. February, I believe my favourite book that month, gosh, this is a hard one. I'm going to say I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. That was a really solid biography. I know it was really popular, and rightfully so. I think it won like the best biographies of the Goodreads challenges last year. March was a weird month in that I either loved things or I hated them. It was the month I read Bunny, so even though The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo comes really close, I'm gonna say Bunny was my favourite book that I read in March. April, gosh, this one's difficult. I read a lot of really solid books in April. This was like a Magical Readathon month for me. I think I'm gonna go with Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies because I think of all the books that I've read, it's the one that stuck with me. Like when I was reading, I think Jasmine Throne was probably one I really enjoyed more, but like Emily Wilde is really a grower for me. So I'm gonna say that is my favourite book in April. In May, let's have a look. Ooh, this one's tough because I have 2 5-star books. It's between The Writing Retreat or Her Body and Other Parties. I'm gonna go with Her Body and Other Parties, I think, just because, yeah, like, but they're both super solid books. It's actually really hard for me to choose between them. June, this was a bit of a weird reading month for me. I had a lot of average books, but I read In the Lives of Puppets, so that one is going to be my best book of June, easily. July, I read a lot of horror in July. So this one's tough, actually. I think it's between The Last Graduate, which is the second book in the Scholomance series, or it's The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. It's between these two, and I'm honestly not sure, so I'm just gonna say both. August, I read a lot of books, but it was also a big hit and miss month for me. However, one of those books I read was Divine Rivals. Fourth Wing comes very close, but Divine Rivals made me cry so much, so it's gonna be my favourite book of the month. September, let's see. Red, White and Royal Blue. That would be my favourite, easily. October was when I read a ridiculous amount. So I have to go through a lot here to work out what my favourite of the month is. I think it's gonna be It Came From the Closet, because it just has all of my favourite things in one thing. It's all about queer. It's all queer essays on horror movies, and yeah, it was so good. I really enjoyed it. Would definitely recommend it. November, The Adventures of Mina Al-Sarafi. Easily. Don't even have to think about that one. And then December, let's see. Again, this was a very mixed reading month for me. I'm gonna say Heartstopper Volume 5. I think was my favourite book of the month. There were some really good books I read, but I think that is the one that is just kind of like, it's a solid 5-star. So yeah, those are my favourite books of each of the months. So finally, I'm going to get into my top 10 most disappointing and my top 10 best books of 2023. I'm saying most disappointing books, not my worst books, because I feel like it's a better stat for me, because I don't necessarily like to say the books are bad. If the book is bad, I'll DNF it, you know? And often they're bad in a way that I'll just forget them, honestly. Like, they're bad in that kind of way, but for me, I think for a book to really stand out as being something that sticks with me in a negative way, it's because it's disappointing. Whether it's because it's a sequel that didn't, live up to things, whether the ending ruined it, whether it's just a book that has been really hyped up, a book I'm super excited for, and then I read it and I'm just like, oh, that's it. So that is what we're going to go with first, just so we can get the negative out of the way, and then move on to the positive of my best book. With my most disappointing books of 2023, I only have a small pile here, because a lot of them are books that I have just got rid of, essentially. Like, they're books that I've already on hold, so I don't have them physically anymore to share, so I'll just put some visuals up for that. First, however, I thought I would do my honorary mentions, and those are the books that I DNF'd. So I DNF'd 5 books in 2023, and those are The Night Watch. I'm going to say it's a soft DNF. It's one I may go back to, but I've been looking forward to reading it for a long time, and then I just didn't click with it. I didn't think I realised it was YA. I really thought it was adult. And yeah, I just wasn't enjoying it, so I didn't get very far and then I dropped it. The Ex-Hex was another one which I was kind of sad to DNF, because I've heard so many people who adore this book, but it just didn't work for me, unfortunately. Like, the romance didn't click with me and I didn't enjoy the characters. Kafka on the Shore, you will see this in my December wrap-up, why I ended up DNFing this. I also DNF'd a graphic novel, which was a very thick graphic novel. It was like this big or something, and it's called The Pride Omnibus, and it's kind of like queer superheroes and stuff, and I just wasn't vibing with it when I read it. Like, again, it's what I wanted to love, but I found it to be almost a little too centered on the male superheroes and that kind of humor, and yeah, I wasn't vibing. And the final book I DNF'd was a short story anthology called The Dream Lover, and it just wasn't for me, basically. So on to my top 10 disappointing books of 2023. We're going from the least worst to the most worst. So at number 10 spot, this one was really hard. I feel like I could have swapped out a few books for this one, but I'm going to go with The Devotion of Suspect X for number 10. Mostly because it was me again trying mysteries and thrillers. This was for the Literally Dead Book Club, I believe. And I just didn't really enjoy it, basically. Like, I just found it to be a disappointing mystery and I wasn't vibing. So yeah, that was my number 10. Number 9 is a graphic novel called Bloom. It's got nice artwork, it has some very cute moments, but I had some real issues with how the protagonist acted in a lot of the book, and I really didn't like how he acted with regards to their romantic relationship a lot of the time. It is an LGBT romance between 2 boys, and it has such a cute premise, gorgeous art, but yeah, I had issues, basically. Number 8, Children of Paradise. This was a book that I think I'd gotten the wrong idea of from the premise. I really thought it was going to be totally up my alley. It was up there in what I thought was going to be a 5-star. Basically, it is about this girl who ends up working at this like really weird old rundown cinema that like specializes in like old movies and stuff, and there's like this colorful cast of characters who all work there, and it's really strange, and I really thought it was going to go towards like magical realism from how it sounded, but it didn't, and it ended up just, I don't really know what genre to call it. It was just kind of, it was weird, but not in a way I liked. The characters I didn't gel with, and it was just very kind of depressing and kind of toxic was how I felt when I was reading it. So I just really didn't enjoy where it went. So yeah, just very disappointing basically. Next is one I do have a physical book for, and it is, oh hello, Hannibal by Thomas Harris. I can't remember if I was doing BookTube when I actually read this. I don't think I was, but basically I already know the story for this. Like, I think I've seen the film, so I knew what was going to happen, and I enjoyed a lot of this book for the first like half of it, and then it kind of basically what the main character does, I don't enjoy where her interactions and her relationship goes with Hannibal, so it just felt very out of character, and I did not enjoy the path it took basically. So that's why it is on here on this list. Number 6 then is Hannibal Rising. This book just felt pointless to me, honestly. A lot of people, I've seen them say that it's just kind of fan service. Basically, they just wanted Thomas Harris to write more Hannibal, so he wrote a prequel book, which kind of goes into how Hannibal became Hannibal from his childhood, but I didn't like it. No one felt like they were in character. There was too much focus on like the villains that I really wasn't interested in. And yeah, I just didn't enjoy it, unfortunately. So it was very disappointing. I'm likely going to be unhauling this very soon. At number 5 is a manga, and it's My Secret Affection Volume 1. You may have seen me have a good old vent about this back when I read it in August. But basically it was a book that, it was just mismarketed, I think, for me. Like, it was actually marketed as being an LGBT book, and it is, but in a weird way that doesn't really show LGBT as positive. So it's a really weird premise, and that's why I bought it, because I thought it was interesting. I also mistook the manga author artist for a different series who wrote A Sign of Affection, and I thought it was like a spin-off or like the same series, and I only found out very recently that it wasn't. So I completely picked up the wrong book basically to begin with, so I didn't get off to a good start. But yeah, just to kind of very briefly go over it, it is a sci-fi but more of a contemporary romance. It is basically has this like this thing happens and everyone in the world is gay, and the main girl is not gay, and she has kind of like fallen for her like childhood best friend, and she's just like, I don't know what to do. He's probably gay too. Is he straight? Being straight is weird. So it was just kind of like this reverse thing where it was like the opposite of how like you're the only gay person, and it's like I'm the only straight person. Overall, it was just a very typical like romance shoujo manga at the end of it, and I didn't love it. I didn't love the main character. I thought a lot of it was very contrived in what happened, so it was just really disappointing to me. Gorgeous artwork, don't get me wrong, gorgeous art, weird premise, but not great. Number 4 was The Magician's Guild by Trudy Canavan. This was a book that I've been holding on to for a long time. I assume it's popular. It's actually had this whole like new special editions come out recently by Alima Crate or Fairyloot, I think, so I know it's popular. So I went into it really thinking I'd like it, and I just found it very bland. Honestly, like, it was just very standard fantasy. I know it's an older series, so that probably has something to do with it, but I just wasn't enjoying it. I didn't care about the characters. It took so long for anything to happen, and it was like kind of obvious where it was going and what was going to happen, so it was just very frustrating seeing it kind of just being like everything was being put off for so long. So yeah, it was just very disappointing to me, and not a series I will be continuing. Number 3, I'm sad to say it because it is one of my book club books picks, but it's Fina by Nino Cipri, and I'm gonna say this is not like her auto. I'm not gonna read any more by this author because I will. I think for me this was not a bad book, but it just didn't do what I kind of wanted it to do. So it's got this really fun premise. It's essentially this old lady gets lost in like IKEA, and she ends up finding herself took away to like a different dimension or something, and then these like two employees had to go and get her, and they've got their own kind of like, they were used to be dating, so they have this all like weird relationship with each other. And I think I've liked it more since I've read it, but I just remember reading it and just not clicking with it as much as I wanted to, so it's a sad disappointing. And maybe it's also one that I will give it another try, because it might be one that I like more on a reread when I have different expectations for it. But I really think it's one of those books that I had such high expectations for this being like this fun, zany kind of book, and that wasn't really what it was for me. So yeah, not a bad book. Do not get me wrong, this is not a bad book, but it just was disappointing for me. So yeah, a shame, but I have to put it down as low as this in the list, primarily because it disappointed me so much when I thought I was going to love it. Number 2 is Lesser Known Monsters. This is an indie published LGBT, I think it's YA fantasy book, but it gets smutty. And this was something I buddy read with some friends, and we actually got it as like a recommendation from the bookseller at the time, and I felt really bad, but none of us liked it. It was just not amazing in terms of its plot. The protagonist was kind of a wet blanket, and none of us could take the romance seriously. So again, I feel like it's a book that for the right audience, I think it would really be loved, but I didn't like it, basically. And it's a shame because, you know, the three of us were buddy reading it, we were really excited to read it, and then we were all just not liking it. So on to what is my most disappointing book of 2023. Again, it's not the worst. I gave this book a 3-star, but it has to be here as my number 1 because I feel like it's the book that I personally have vented the most about. I wasn't expecting to be disappointed, but I was definitely wary going in, and it basically just proved all of my worries right. And that is Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. I don't know what more I can say about this, honestly. It just wasn't what I wanted it to be. I found it to be incredibly slow. I didn't really love any of the characters or the storylines, and it wasn't enough for me introducing this whole new world, these whole new characters. I wasn't invested. So I know that I've not really heard what people think about this book, to be honest. Like, I feel like it's had lots of good reviews, but also a lot of mixed reviews. So I'm not really sure where, like, the community kind of stands on this book. But for me, it is probably one of the most disappointing books by Cassandra Clare I've read. And I am a Cassandra Clare fan. There's some of her books I love, there's some of her books I really don't like, but this one definitely goes into the ones that I don't like. And it was just a complete miss for me. I'm almost offended that I spent so long trying to get through this, and I kept giving it a chance and giving it a chance, hoping it would get faster in terms of its pace, hoping it would get better and that I'd enjoy it. But even the ending was disappointing to me, which is where it could have really gone in a direction that would have made me want to carry on with the series. I'm not sad to say it, but it is easily my most disappointing book of 2023. So now that the negative is out of the way, we can get into my best books of 2023. The ones that I want to yell about from the rooftops, the ones that I will constantly yell at people to read, the ones that made my year, honestly. So here they are. As with the most disappointing books, I've also got some honourable mentions because I just couldn't quite manage to get just my top 10. I needed to just yell about some more books as well that I really liked in this year. 5, technically 6 because it's a series, and I enjoyed the books in the series, so 5 but 6. First book was The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This was one of the first books I read in this year, and I buddy read this with Jules Gemhart's. I didn't enjoy the sequel as much, unfortunately, but this was a really solid book and I really enjoyed it. So, honourable mention number 1. Honourable mention number 2 is one you've already seen in this vlog, Juno Dawson's Her Majesty's Royal Coven series. Really enjoyed this, solid series, would always recommend it. Honourable mention number 3. This one was hard because this could have been in my top 10. I feel like I could have swapped this with the number 10 slot in my top 10, but the thing with this book is that I didn't love it straight away. I liked it for the first half, then I really started enjoying it, And I finished the book and I was like, that was good, that was a solid 4-star. And then it's kind of stuck with me. And the more I've had time away from it, the more I've enjoyed it. It would almost be in my top 10, but I think because it was a grower book for me, I'm just going to put it as an honorable mention. And that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. Really good book. You've probably heard a lot of other people talking about this book. It is, you know, an enemies to lovers. There's not really a lot of romance in it, to be honest, but it is a fantasy book about fae and stuff. And the characters are really great, the setting is great, and it went in directions I didn't think it was going to go. But really good book, and I have the sequel already that I'm going to be reading very soon. I'm excited to get to it. Next for honourable mentions is The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Court. This could be in my most surprising books of the year, because I really disliked her other book, Nothing But Black and Teeth. I think not many people liked it, but this book came out, I was like, loved the premise, but because it's Cassandra Court, I was hesitant to try it, honestly, because that one was so bad, but this one was brilliant. It was just perfect. The writing, I think, fit really well with the setting and the story that had been chosen, and yeah, just a really big surprise of the year. And then finally, honorable mention is The Darkness Outsiders by Elliot Scrafer. This is a sci-fi queer space opera kind of thing about these two boys who end up being on space in a mission, basically, and it gets weird and sad and mind-blowing, and I really liked it. It was really solid, and I definitely, this is like the kind of thing when I'm like, I want to get into sci-fi. This is the kind of book I mean when I'm like, this is good sci-fi for me, basically. So those are my honorable mentions. So now we're going to get into the top 10, my best books that I enjoyed the most in 2023. So number 10, yes, everyone has been talking about it, everyone has read it. Does it live up to the hype? For me, it did. Fourth Wing by Rekha Yaros. Really enjoyed it. I have to put it at the very top of this list because there are definitely books that are better. Don't get me wrong, but honestly, I enjoyed this so much. I loved every minute of it, so I can't not put it in my top 10 because if we're just going in terms of enjoyment, this was it for me. So yeah, dragon book, romance, which I'm usually not a fan of, but I loved the romance in this. The dragons were so good. They were my favourite part in this book, and yeah, I am one of those people that still hasn't gotten to Iron Flame yet. I've heard very mixed reviews about it, but I will get to it soon and report back as to whether the sequel is good as well. But yeah, for me, it's in my top 10. So I don't have physical copies for all of these books, unfortunately. I will be getting them, but for some of them, I'm like waiting for like special editions and stuff, and I just haven't got to it yet. So at number 9 is actually a contemporary romance, which is a shocker for me. And it's Red, White and Royal Blue. It also had a movie out this year, which wasn't that good, but basically, if you don't know what it's about, it is an LGBT story about the son of the American president who falls for the son of the king, queen, whatever, of England. So it's kind of like, it's got this political aspect to it as well, but I just really enjoyed it. I found it very heartwarming. It was, again, like a soft blanket of a book to read, made me cry a lot, and I appreciated a lot of the more in-depth messages that were in it. Like, it wasn't just like a silly romance, I guess. So yeah, that is number 9 in my list. Number 8 is one that you've already heard me mention in this video so far, and that is Bunny by Mona Awad. Just really enjoyed it. It was weird in all the right ways. It gave me Mean Girls, but extremely creepy, and yeah, I loved it. If you're interested in psychological, I guess dark academia you could call this, I'm not really sure what to call it. It was a lot of fun, it was very weird, and enjoyed it a lot. Shockingly, number 7 on my list is a thriller mystery, and that's The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz. I always say that I love books about books, and this one is one of those. It's about a bunch of writers who all get invited to the isolated location where they're like this very famous sort of like feminist shocking writer who doesn't see people very often is holding this retreat, and then there's a competition aspect to it too, but then people start dying. And yeah, really enjoyed it. It got weird, which I loved. So again, thriller mysteries, if they get weird, I think they kind of work for me. So yeah, loved this. This is a debut book actually by Julia Bartz, and I'm definitely going to be checking out the next books that she comes out with because it was brilliant. Number 6 is Juniper and Fawn by, my god, Ava Reid, I want to say this is. Who also has another very popular book out this year, In the Study in Drowning. And I went into this book, again, like it's a fairy tale kind of book based around the juniper tree, which is not a fairy tale I'm very familiar with. I just loved this. Like, it was very dark, it was very soft. The romance, I feel like a lot of people wouldn't like, but I really liked it. And yeah, I just thought it was a really dark, delicious fairy tale kind of book, and just up my alley completely. So that is up there as my number 6 book. Number 5 is a book I also read at the start of the year, and it is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. And I have to thank Lit Couture for this because I did not realise that the sequel was coming out so soon, and I'm very excited for it. So, because I absolutely adored this. It is a Arabian Nights themed story. It gets likened a lot to the City of Brass series by S.A. Chakraborty, which I read later in the year, and I could definitely see the similarities to the point where my brain has kind of started melding the details together. So I'm probably going to have to reread this before I actually end up going and reading the sequel, but I loved this so much. I yelled about this to one of my friends who then read it and also really liked it. And yeah, it's just really good. The characters are brilliant, the world building is great, and just really, really solid epic fantasy. Okay, we're on to the top 4. So, surprising no one because I've already mentioned it like a million times. Number 4 is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. I want to read more anthologies and short stories in the new year, and this is just like this really good, it's all about horror and gender and sexuality, and it was just, it was good. It was so good. I loved it. It was everything I wanted. So that is my number 4. Number 3, another buddy read, actually, that I did, In the Lies of Puppets by TJ Klune. This, for anyone who doesn't know, is a sci-fi Pinocchio retelling about this boy who gets kind of brought up by robots, and then he finds like another robot, and there is this like relationship between them. But it was so good. I had an absolute ball with it. The characters were great. And it went places again that I didn't expect this book to go, and it was very sad in places. But definitely a highlight of my year. It's in my top 3. Number 2. This was so almost my number 1 before something came along and just stole the show. But number 2 is Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. You've probably already heard me gush about this book. I love it so much. I was so invested in the characters, the world is really interesting, and yeah, I don't know what else I can say about it. If you've not heard of it before, it is kind of like a alternate universe setting set around like the World War II area, but in like a more fantasy war kind of setting, and it's about these 2 war journalists called Roman and Ivy who end up being connected by this like magical typewriter, but they're also like rivals in journalism, and they kind of go off and become war journalists. Still surprises me this is a YA, honestly. Like, I really thought it was an adult book. But yeah, I loved this so much. I sobbed so much. I am so invested in the characters. I was kind of mad when I got to the end and I realised it was not a standalone, but I'm obviously very excited to read more from this. So I do have the sequel. Haven't got to it yet, but I'm itching to get to it because I just need to know what happens to these 2 because I love them so much and I love this book so much. So that is number 2. Can you guess what my number 1 is? I don't have a physical copy of it yet, which upsets me. But my number 1 book of 2023 is The Adventures of Mina Al-Sarafi by S.A. Chakraborty. This book was so much fun, and I am lost for words, honestly, of how good this book was. It was fun. We had an amazing female protagonist who was not like a young girl. She was like a mother with all like this experience and stuff. There was such a great cast of characters, a great queer cast of characters, honestly, as well. The world building was brilliant. It makes me want to go back to the City of Brass series because I tried the first book and I just didn't quite click with it, but this book was perfection to me. I know it's going to be a while before the sequel comes out, and I'm just so excited for it already because this is just a book I know I'm going to reread a lot, and it was amazing. So I implore you, if you have not read about this book, or it's a book that you've just kind of had sitting on your shelf and you're like, I'll get to it eventually, get to it. It is so worth it. So I have some last little stats that I want to go over, and then that will be it for the end of your stats video. So I was intrigued about how many of the books that I read this year were actually books that were released in 2023. I often read a lot. I used to always read a lot of older books, but I think I've actually been trying to be up to date a bit more of what's coming out. So I actually managed to read 18 books that were released in this year. So they were Emily Wells' Encyclopedia of Fairies, The Writing Retreat, In the Lives of Puppets, Fourth Wing, The Shadow Cabinet, The Only One Left, The 3 O'Clock Dragon, Divine Rivals, Page Boy, How to Sell a Haunted House, The Salt Grows Heavy, Twisted Wonderland Volume 1, Swordcatcher, The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, Tress of the Emerald Sea, Bitterthorn, Heartstopper Volume 5, and Ashes to Ashes. And in terms of my genres, if I had to pick a book which is my favourite of all the genres for the year, this one was hard, so we're just going to go through this quite quickly. But fantasy, obviously, it's The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi. Manga, Twisted Wonderland Volume 1. It lived up to my expectations, so I can't not put it. Graphic novel, Across a Field of Starlight. This was a beautiful LGBT graphic novel. I can't wait to own my own copy. Check it out, please, especially if you're interested in non-binary representation and sci-fi. Contemporary, Red, White and Royal Blue. Horror, Her Body and Other Parties. Thriller mystery, I mean, you already saw it, but The Writing Retreat. Sci-fi, The Darkness Outsiders. Non-fiction, I believe I have somewhere. Here it is. It Came from the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror. Historical, Where the Crawdads Sing. I know, I'm surprised too. Really enjoyed this. I guess it's a historical but also a mystery, but I'm putting it in historical for this. Biography, I'm Glad My Mum Died. So, one of the last things I want to go over is my favourite book cover of the year. And I actually have 2 honorary mentions for this one. So, honorary mention wise, we have Emily Wells' Encyclopedia of Fairies. I'm really glad that the UK have this version because I adore it. I like it so much more than the US version. And These Witches Don't Burn by Isabel Sterling. I just love the aesthetic of this. It's the cover that made me buy it, quite honestly. But my favourite book cover of the year has to be the Fairy Loot edition of Divine Rivals. I just think it's so gorgeous. It has these gorgeous letters on the edges. It's got these foiling end papers, and even under the dust jacket it's just this very simple white thing with foiling, but it's just so beautiful. It is easily my favourite special edition, let alone just my favourite book cover of the year. And just because I thought it was fun and I saw someone else doing this, my favourite book adaptation I've seen this year, and I'm kind of torn between 2 things here, honestly. So for me, it's between Nimona, which got a Netflix film, which I thought was brilliant. I thought the things it changed from the original worked really well. It really brought it up to date. And One Piece, the live action Netflix show. Both Netflix shows, weirdly. Netflix films, shows, whatever. But they're both on Netflix. But yeah, I thought it was such a good time, even for someone who isn't a fan of One Piece, like my friend isn't. Really enjoyed it. It's just big, dumb pirate fun, honestly. So, I've seen other people do this and I just thought it would be fun, but I thought I would lay out all the books I've read in 2023 that I own anyway. So I read more than this, obviously, but I thought I would just have a little look and show you guys what they look like in physical, because that's always fun to see. So this is the final stack. I've stacked them in terms of months. So we have 2 months in each stack here. So let's see, we've got January and February, a very pink looking pile. March and April, May and June, a lot of green. July and August, a lot of chunkers. September and October, I have to zoom out because it's so big. And finally, November and December. So that is all of them. So that is my end of year stats. I had a lot of fun kind of putting this all together. Watch out for that tier ranking. It is going to be coming very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe, stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!